message this morning is called Unfinished, because I think we're all works in progress. We all are on various places in terms of our own spirituality, or in terms of our own maturity, in terms of our age. Everyone is in a different place, and yet everybody is here this morning for the same reason, and that's to praise our Lord Jesus Christ and to thank God for his sacrifice. So I wanted to talk to you today about being unfinished, and that's okay. And it's taken from Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, that says, God began doing a good work in you, and I am sure he will continue it until it is finished when Jesus Christ comes again. I want to tell you a story. And the story is the hallway in this particular case is eerily silent. It's silent except for the squeaky wheels of a mop bucket and the shuffling of an old man's feet. Both sound tired, and both know these floors. And how many times and how many nights have I cleaned these floors? Rick is his name. He mumbles that. How many times have I been here doing this? He's always careful to get in the corners, though. He's always careful to set up his yellow caution sign warning that the floor is all wet, even though there's absolutely no one around. He's always chuckling. He says out loud, "Be careful, everyone." And he's saying this to people at 3 o'clock in the morning when there's no one there. Rick's health isn't what it used to be. The acid reflux keeps him awake at night. The rheumatoid arthritis makes him limp. His hair is falling out of his head at the same rate as his hair is sprouting up in other places that he'd rather not it appear. His glasses are so thick that his eyeballs look kind of like twice their size. But he does his work. And his work is this: slopping soapy water on pristine travertine tile. Because he's scrubbing the heel marks left by the well-heeled lawyers of bicker back and forth. And he'll be finished a long time before quitting. He always finishes early, and he has for the past 20 years of his life. And when he's finished, he'll put away his mop, he'll put away his bucket, he'll take a seat outside the office of the senior partner and wait. He never, ever leaves early. Oh, he could, because there's nobody there. Nobody would catch him. No one would know. But he doesn't. Because Rick knows that he broke the rules once, and he's vowed he's never going to do it again. And sometimes, if the door is open to that senior partner's office, he'll walk in. It's palatial. I mean, he's not there for very long, but he's just there to take a look. The office suite is larger than his entire apartment. He runs his finger across the desk. He strokes the soft leather couch. He stands at the window and watches as this gray sky now starts turning to gold. And he remembers. He remembers that he once had an office just like that. But for Rick, that was like way back in the day. Back when Rick was actually Richard. Back when this custodian was an executive. Back when, well, it seems like it's been a century or more at this point. Long before the night shift, long before the mop bucket, long before the janitor's uniform, long before the scandal. But Rick, he doesn't really think about that much anymore. But Rick really has no reason to, actually. He got in trouble, he got fired, and he got out. It's kind of the story. Not many people know about it, and it's probably better that way. At least that's the way Rick thinks. There's no need to tell them. It's just his little secret. It's Rick's story. And Rick's story, by the way, is true. Now, I've changed the names and the details just a little bit to kind of protect the innocent, because Rick is in a different job in a different century. But the story is absolutely factual. But more than a story, it's a common story, because it's a story of a derailed dream. It's a story that has high hopes colliding with really harsh realities. And it happens to all of us, because we all from time to time dream. In Rick's case, it was a mistake that he would never be able to forget. It was a serious mistake. It was a grave mistake. It was a fatal mistake. It was a capital offense. You see, Rick had killed someone. Rick had seen a thug beating up on an innocent man, and Rick lost control, and he killed the mugger. And when word got out, Rick got out. Rick would rather hide than go to jail, so he ran. And in the process, the executive now became the fugitive. And again, this is a true story. Now, granted, most stories aren't quite as extreme as Rick's. Few of us spend our lives running from the law, but a lot of us live with regrets. For instance, I met a young man on the fourth tee of a golf course several years ago. And here's what he told me. I could have gone on to college on a golf scholarship. And I said, really? Yeah, I had an offer right out of high school. But I decided to join a grunge band. And I ended up never going to college. Now I'm stuck fixing garage doors. Not that there's anything bad about people fixing garage doors. That takes skill. But here's somebody who had so much promise out of high school, could have gone to college on a college scholarship, makes a different choice in life, and ends up doing something very different than what he had ever expected. And then he said, you know what, I'm stuck. And I was thinking, you know, that's quite an epitaph, isn't it? The epitaph of a derailed dream. You know, you pick up a high school yearbook and you read, what are you going to do after you graduate? You've read that high school yearbook, haven't you? Every once in a while you go back and kind of reminisce. Chances are you'll get dizzy breathing the thin air of all these mountaintop visions that are in your senior high school yearbook. I'm going on to an Ivy League school, one says. I'm going to write books and I'm going to live in Switzerland, says another. I'm going to be a doctor in a third world country, writes one of your classmates. I'm going to teach inner city kids. But take that same yearbook to your 20th reunion, and you can just see the next chapter of their book. Some dreams have come true, but many haven't. Not that all of them should, mind you. For instance, I hope the little guy who dreamed of playing professional basketball in my high school class kind of came to his senses, because he was really short. I don't think he would have made it. But then on the other hand, I'm thinking, I hope that he didn't lose his passion in the process. Maybe you can't be a pro basketball player, but you can still be passionate about a sport or an activity or athleticism. You see, changing direction in life is not tragic, church, but losing your passion is. And it seems like something happens to all of us along the way. Convictions to change the world then morph into our commitments to having to pay the bills. Rather than making a difference in life, we make a living. Instead of looking forward, we look backward. Rather than looking outward, we look inward. And sometimes we don't like what we see. Rick didn't. Rick saw a man who had settled for mediocrity, educated in the finest institutions in the world, and now working the night shift at a minimum wage job so he wouldn't be seen during the day. But all that changed when Rick heard the voice. I'm not talking about the TV show. At first, he thought that this voice was just a joke. Some of the fellows on the third floor, they kind of play jokes on each other. All the janitorial staff at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning have nothing else better to do, so they just kind of pull a fast one on the other ones that are working on different floors. Richard, the voice said. Rick turned. He looked, couldn't find anybody, couldn't see anybody, couldn't understand why he was hearing his name being repeated, and then it happened again. Richard. He turned toward the pail, and it's now glowing. It's bright red. It is hot red. He could feel the heat 10 feet away from his mop bucket. He stepped closer and looked in, but the water wasn't boiling. This thing was like on fire, but the water wasn't boiling inside. That's strange, Rick mumbles to himself as he takes another step to get a little bit closer to the bucket, and then the voice stops him. Don't come any closer, Richard. Take your shoes off. You are on holy tile. Suddenly, Rick knew exactly who was speaking, right? Yes, Lord, he said. Okay. God speaking from a hot mop bucket to a janitor named Rick. I mean, really, Randy? Aren't you carrying the story just a bit far? But would it be more believable if I said to you that God was speaking from a burning bush to a goat roper named Moses? One day, Moses was taking care of Jethro's flock. Jethro was a priest in the Midianites and also Moses' father-in-law. And when Moses led the flock to the west side of the desert, he came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire coming out of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but it was not burning up. So he said, I'll go closer to this strange thing. How can a bush continue burning without burning up? When the Lord saw Moses was coming to look at the bush, God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Then God said, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. I am the God of your ancestors. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac, and I am the God of Jacob. The Lord said, I have heard the cries of the people of Israel, and I have seen the way of the Egyptians and how life has been made so hard for them. So now I am sending you to the king of Egypt. Go, bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. That's taken from the Old Testament book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 and 9 and 10. Church, I'm not making that up. That's what the Bible says. And maybe this story about Moses is easier to handle because most of us have heard it before, right? I don't think there's anybody here that hasn't heard the story about Moses in the burning bush, right? We've all heard it before, probably many times before. But just because it's Moses and a bush rather than Rick and a mop bucket, it's no less spectacular, right? I mean, it shocked the sandals off of Moses. And we wonder what amazed the old guy more, that God spoke in a bush or that God spoke at all. Because Moses, like Rick, had made a huge mistake. Moses had made a big mistake. You remember the story, don't you? Moses was adopted into nobility. He was an Israelite, but he was reared in the Egyptian palace. His countrymen were slaves, but Moses lived a very, very privileged life. He ate at the royal table. He was educated at the most and the best schools available. Funny thing is that his most influential teacher had no degree at all. She was his mother. She was a Jewess who had been hired to be Moses' nanny. And Moses, you can almost hear her whisper to her young son, God has put you here for a reason. Someday, Moses, someday you'll set our people free. Never forget, my son. Don't ever forget. And Moses didn't, because when he's a young man, the flame of justice starts burning very brightly inside of him. Because remember, Moses is a Jew living among Egyptians, but he's living in the palace. And Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And just like Rick killed the mugger, Moses killed the Egyptian and then buried him. The next day, Moses saw the slave. Now you'd think that the slave would have said, oh man, sir, thank you for saving my life. But he didn't. You'd think the slave would have some gratitude, but he didn't. Rather than gratitude, the slave was angry. Are you going to kill me too? And Moses knew right then that he was in big, big trouble. So he fled Egypt and hid in the wilderness. And I guess, you can call it a career change, right? He went from dining with heads of state to counting heads of sheep. Now, Moses believed that this career change was a permanent one for him. There's no indication that Moses ever intended to go back to Egypt. In fact, there is every indication that he wanted to stay with the sheep. Standing barefoot before the bush, he confessed, I am not a great man. How can I go to the king and lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he says. Exodus chapter 3, verse 11. And I'm glad Moses asked that question, because it's a pretty good one, I think. Yeah, why Moses, of all people? Better yet, why an 80-year-old Moses? The 40-year-old version would have been a whole lot more appealing, don't you think? The Moses we saw in Egypt was brash and he was confident. But the Moses we find 4 decades later is reluctant and he's weather-beaten. Had you or I looked at Moses back in Egypt, we would have said, that guy is ready to rumble. Trained by the ablest soldiers, instant access to the inner circle of Pharaoh, Moses spoke their language and he knew their habits. He would have been the perfect man for the job. The Moses at 40 we like, but the Moses at 80? Not much. He's like way too old. He's too tired. He smells like sheep. He speaks like a foreigner. What impact could Moses possibly have on Pharaoh? He's the wrong guy for the job, don't you think? And even Moses would have agreed. Well, I tried that once before. He'd say, those people don't want to be helped. Just leave me here to tend my sheep, God. They're a whole lot easier to lead than those crazy people in Egypt. You know, I think in reading through the story, if it were up to Moses, he wouldn't have gone. And you wouldn't have sent him, right? I know I wouldn't have sent him. But God did. Go figure. Benched at 40 and suited up at 80. Why? What does he know now that he didn't know then? What did he learn in the desert that he did not learn in Egypt? Well, the ways of the desert, for one. 40-year-old Moses was a city boy. Octogenarian Moses knows the name of every snake and the location of every watering hole. And if Moses is going to lead thousands, perhaps millions of people out of Egypt into the wilderness, he'd better know the basics of Desert Life 101. And family dynamics is another thing. I mean, if he's going to be traveling with hundreds or thousands of people for 40 long years, it might help just a little bit to understand how families work, don't you think? And by this time, Moses has been married a long time to a woman of faith, the daughter of a Midianite priest. And Moses now has kids of his own. He gets family. He gets desert. But more than the ways of the desert and more than the ways of family, Moses needed to learn something about Moses. And apparently he'd learned it because God said that Moses was ready. And to convince him, God spoke to him through a bush. Now, granted, that's a little odd, but sometimes God does things to get our attention, doesn't he? School's out, basically, God told him, now get to work. And I'm thinking, poor Moses. I mean, he didn't even know he was enrolled in school, much less now a graduate. But he was. And guess what? So are we. The voice from the bush is the voice that whispers to each of us. It reminds us that God is not finished with us yet. Oh, we may think that he is. We may think that we've peaked out. We may think he's got someone else to do the job other than us. But if we're thinking that, we need to really think again, because we're all unfinished, church. It says in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, God began doing a good work in you, and I'm sure he will continue it until it is finished when Jesus Christ comes again. Look at that verse. Do you see what God is doing? He's doing a good work in you. That's the present tense. And do you see when he'll be finished? When Jesus comes again. That's the future tense. God is with you and me presently and in the future. In other words, church, we're all unfinished. Your Father wants you to know that you are a work in progress. Your present has not met your ultimate future. And to convince you, he may just surprise you. He works that way, you know. He may speak through a bush. He could even speak through a bucket. The question is, are you listening? I did something to my back this morning, so I'm going to get up really gingerly. Thank you. Church, God is not finished with you. God is not finished with me. He's not finished with Oak Hill. We're all a work in progress. But each of us are important to the progress of this church. Each of us acting on our own is important in growing and maturing. The Moses of 40 would have been the person that we would have picked. The Moses of 80 is the one that God picked because he needed to have some experience. Let me give you a better and more recent comparison. Jesus has now ascended into heaven and wants to advance his church. Who does he pick to be the principal individual to advance God's kingdom here on earth? His name was Saul of Tarsus. And do you know what his most famous qualification was? He killed Christians. Now, I'm thinking probably a Christian killer is not the person I want to lead Christians. That's kind of like putting the fox into the hen house, don't you think? And yet Saul of Tarsus had an experience through Jesus that left him blind for 3 days to hear the truth of what he was doing, to make him change. You see, it wasn't God trying to change his passion. He was an extremely passionate person. He was passionate about putting Christians in jail and killing them. So God just educated him, look, keep your passion, but let's advance Christianity, let's not destroy it. And God has given all of you a talent, an ability, and doesn't want you to lose your passion. He just wants you to focus it on something that benefits his kingdom. And I can't do what you can do. You all can do what I'm doing. I just stand up here and talk. You can do that. But all of us have a talent. All of us have an ability. And I don't want us to get sidetracked on the fact that, well, I'm too old, or I'm not skilled enough, or I don't have enough qualifications. That's baloney. Because we are all unfinished business. God is not finished with me yet. That's what Paul, writing to the church in Philippi, says. God is doing a good work in you presently. And we'll continue to do that good work until when? Until Jesus comes. So church, you are in process. I am in process. And all of us engaged together in this process are what's going to advance us spiritually and individually and his kingdom in this place. So church, this week, concentrate on Philippians 1:6. Be assured of the fact that God is with you. God loves you. You're in the game. He's in the process of changing you, yes, only so that you can be the child that he created you to be. And sometimes that takes a little work. Unfortunately, sometimes that takes a little hurt. It takes a little work and pain and suffering and disappointments. But that doesn't mean that God has abandoned you. It means that he's shaping you for something that he has intended for you, perhaps that you don't see now, but will in the future. So church, get in the game. Stay in the game. Understand that you are unfinished business. And that when Christ is finally done with you, you'll be the perfect child that he created you to be. So if you have any prayer requests, you can pass them up as we close with this last song. And then we'll talk about those prayer requests, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing, please.